Good morning, everyone. I wanted to start, as Laura did, by giving a shout out to the Michigan Mafia. You make me comfortable up here, so thank you. And I also wanted to thank the conference organizers for inviting me. I didn't initially know what to expect. My degree is actually from a business school, but I migrated to a sociology department after I earned my degree because when I told most people in business schools that I wanted to study organizations because they could teach us about racism. And they would say, "You mean the people in them?" And I said, "No, organizations themselves." We spend a lot of time convincing students that organizations are social actors. And if they indeed are social actors with properties and resources that are distinguishable from individuals, how is it possible that they don't have to deal with racism? I would get blank stares. And so I thought, I've got to find some place where I don't actually get blank stares, and I ended up in a sociology department. So I want to thank you because 12 years ago, I couldn't have imagined a space like this existing within a business school, and so I'm happy to know that there might be some young doctoral student who's no longer getting blank stares when they talk about their desire to study racism in different ways. The second reason that I migrated to a sociology department, I always wanted to mostly read papers. And so I'm gonna have some slides because my advisor told me that you always need a slide so that if a person has been on their cell phone or doing something, they can look up and get a quick sense of what they missed. But by and large, they're just slides with a few words on them, and I'm gonna take full advantage of being in the sociology department and primarily read to you today. All right, so with that, as a comparative historical sociologist, I spend a significant amount of time focused on the past. So when I received the invitation for the conference and realized that the panel was forward-looking, I had to remind myself that part of the reason I study the past is to better understand the present and the future. With that in mind, today, I'll focus on two adaptive strategies that Black colleges have used historically and that are mirrored contemporarily. I will then actually take a step back to show why these strategies are actually present across both the 20th and 21st centuries. I'm going to argue that Black colleges exist within an institutional framework that is always privileged whiteness, white sensitivities, and white logics. This was the case during the race-conscious period, when higher education was legally racially segregated. It remains true today in what many refer to as a race-neutral or colorblind period, when higher education, while no longer legally racially segregated, has actually made little progress in integrating Black students into its framework. By understanding that the race-neutral and race-conscious institutional periods supporting higher education consistently disadvantage Black colleges in similar ways, we actually learn a lot about the nature and shape of white supremacy. That is, as Black colleges adapt, as they push back, as they fight for more resources and respect, they reveal how racism operates at the institutional level to consistently disadvantage them and consistently advantage traditionally white spaces. The first strategy that I'm going to focus on is pragmatism and decoupling. Black colleges were organizational innovators in the area of higher education philanthropy. Not only did Black colleges solicit gifts from foundations, as many institutions of higher education did, they also organized the United Negro College Fund in 1943. This was the first educational community chest. 27 Black private colleges joined together to fundraise. The money was distributed amongst the participating colleges based on their size, so how many students they actually had on campus, and based on the amount of effort that they actually put forth in the campaign. Historians such as Mary Beth Gasman have chronicled how innovative the UNCF was and how it paved the way for other organizations like the American Indian College Fund to come about. Every year since 1944, the UNCF has launched a massive campaign soliciting donations from everyday people, corporations, and foundations. Within these campaign materials, direct reference was made to the disparities in resources between private Black colleges and private white colleges, Institutions like Harvard and Yale and other Ivies oftentimes figured into the imaginings within these campaign documents. The UNCF was an attempt to address the resource disparities with support from the public. I studied the first 10 years of campaigns between 1944 and 1954. I entered into this work with an interest in understanding how this organization convinced white people, everyday white people, as well as white foundation officers and white corporate officials, to donate to it during a time when the right of blacks to actually access higher education, so the right for blacks to even attend college, was hardly a settled matter within the United States. What I found is that as private black colleges used innovative techniques to raise money for their schools, they didn't actually narrate the experience of racism. As they explained why so few black students that wanted to go to college could actually afford to do so, or why black colleges found it difficult to update their facilities and their curriculum, racism was not mentioned as a cause during the first 10 campaigns. A more confrontational, or quite frankly, a more honest assessment of the reasons why black students could not afford to go to college or why black colleges struggled to improve their facilities was not possible at that moment. The institutional framework simply would not allow for it. Decoupling the reality of the situation from the language in the fundraising campaigns enabled the UNCF to raise millions of dollars. In the first campaign alone, the divided proceeds exceeded any amount that any member college had ever raised in a solo fundraising campaign. It's important to note that this decoupling masks the reality of life on the ground at many of these black college campuses. While the UNCF did not narrate the experience of racism, the private black colleges were serving as laboratories of racial justice and civil rights activism that would directly attack and confront racist practices. Black colleges were educational homes at this time to many that would go on to lead the civil rights movement. This includes Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a Morehouse man, Diane Nash, and John Lewis, both Fiskites, as well as countless others. This type of accommodation or pragmatism runs deep in the history of black colleges, but so does the decoupling. The institutional possibilities both shape and demand this tandem adaptive response from black colleges. We see the same strategy used in the 21st century. In 2004, the United Negro College Fund accepted a $25 million donation from the Koch brothers. Onlookers expressed dismay, given the Koch brothers' role in voter suppression and their opposition to living wage legislation. People wanted to know how the UNCF could take money from a group whose positions would harm the black community. These cause of concern and outrage rang familiar to me. Similar concerns were raised when the United Negro College Fund accepted money from the likes of the Rockefellers and others. But knowing that the history of black colleges included both pragmatism and decoupling, I knew it was possible for the UNCF to take money from an organization like the Koch brothers and for individual black colleges to produce politically active and engaged students who might one day lead the challenge against the likes of the Koch Foundation. The second strategy that I'll talk a little bit about is challenging white logics. A large part of my historical work on black colleges has focused on how the markers of legitimacy within higher education disadvantage black colleges. This outcome is not happenstance. It is a result of the racially segregated institutional environment in which higher education emerged. A racially segregated system designed to favor and reward traditionally white colleges for their efforts. Mind you, it doesn't matter that many of their efforts purposefully excluded black students. The institutions accepted and supported these efforts nonetheless as legitimate and developed metrics that took these inequalities for granted. So when Thomas Jesse Jones publishes his study of Negro education in 1917 and claims that private black education was woefully inadequate, producing inferior students, and that Fisk, Meharry, and Howard were the only true institutions of higher learning among all the Black colleges existing at the time. W.E.B. Du Bois, a graduate of Fisk and a former faculty member at Atlanta University, pointed out the dangers of applying white logics to Black colleges. This is a strategy where Black college advocates point out the inconsistencies in these metrics to show that no matter what, Black colleges cannot win in this game. In assessing curriculum at Black colleges, Jones criticized the schools for not abandoning classical studies in Greek and Latin. Du Bois pointed out that few white colleges had abandoned disciplines in Greek and Latin at that time. Jones would have preferred that Black colleges replace those disciplines and incorporate courses in economics and sociology. Du Bois pointed out the personnel difficulties facing Black colleges as they tried to transform their curriculum to include those burgeoning disciplines. Du Bois might have also pointed out that despite being the founder of American sociology and having established the first empirically driven school of sociology at Atlanta University, a Black college, this had done nothing to lead Jones to include Atlanta University among his list of true colleges. Had Du Bois had access to my book, he might have also pointed out that even when Black colleges exhibit organizational patterns that make them indistinguishable from traditionally white colleges, they're still perceived as less legitimate. One of the more recent attempts to call out the application of white logics to Black colleges happened in January 2018, showing that even after 100 years, Black colleges and their advocates deal with similar issues. As the institutional environment surrounding higher education abandoned its outwardly race-conscious framework, the metrics associated with this system, endowment, enrollment, graduation rate, average SAT score of entering freshmen, and many others were never challenged. There was never a moment where education or legal scholars stopped to question the racially encoded assumptions baked into these metrics. Nor was there a moment to debate whether we should come up with new metrics altogether. Instead, as the environment surrounding higher education moved to an allegedly colorblind or race-neutral system, these metrics have been applied to Black colleges indiscriminately and sloppily at times. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution recently published an article stating that the 6-year graduation rate at many Black colleges is lower than 20%. Ivory Toldson, editor-in-chief at the Journal of Negro Education and a professor at Howard University, followed in Du Bois's footsteps when taking this article apart. Toldson noted that the article referred to only 20% of Black colleges, and if 20% is a figure that can stand in for many, then we should also consider the 602 non-historically Black college institutions of higher education, including predominantly white institutions that have graduation rates less than 20%. After digging into the data more, Toldson remarked, most of the 20 HBCUs highlighted were small private HBCUs, and that the small size of their enrollment makes numeric calculations and comparisons of their graduation rates extremely volatile. But more importantly, Toldson explains why graduation rates are actually the wrong metric for these schools altogether. The 20 HBCUs highlighted in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution article, as well as the 602 predominantly white institutions, Hispanic-serving institutions, and tribal colleges, educate students that the most popular universities reject. These students are more likely to need remedial courses in college and to work full-time in order to pay their tuition. As a result, these students typically do not complete college at the same pace as students who benefit from a college preparatory curriculum and have parents who pay their tuition and their living expenses. Therefore, problems arise when trying to compare the graduation rates between the people's institutions with those of highly competitive, affluent institutions of higher education. Toldson finally reminds readers to remember that when it comes to Black people, if it sounds too bad to be true, it probably is. Ultimately, I view the centuries-long fight that Black colleges have engaged in to gain resources and respect as illustrative of how racism operates at the institutional level. We can absolutely use Black colleges as a case study to understand specific strategies such as pragmatism and decoupling or combating white logics in their attempts to overcome disparate resources and respect that emanate from this reality. But we should also understand Black colleges as a case study that says a lot about how white supremacy operates in higher education. As Palmer reminds us, white supremacy is not a person or a group of people. It is an ideology. And ideology is fancy sociology speak for a collection of ideas that work together to affect how we see and understand the world around us. And as an ideology, white supremacy encourages us to value white people, white culture, and everything associated with whiteness above the people, culture, and everything associated with people of color. If we weren't so tethered to an institutional framework that privileged whiteness, we might use different statistics to measure the worthiness of colleges and universities altogether. If we focused on different statistics, we would be forced to contemplate the failures of traditionally white colleges, especially as it relates to the education of Black students. For instance, an analysis done by The Atlantic showed that between 1994 and 2016, the percentage of Black undergraduates at top-tier universities held flat at 6%. No one is calling for the closure of top-tier traditionally white colleges because the percentage of Black students they enroll more than 60 years after Brown versus the board remains well below 10%. Comparatively, according to the Pew Research Center, Black colleges accounted for 9% of all Black students enrolled in higher education in 2015. These institutions that make up 3% of all colleges and universities accounted for 15% of the bachelor degrees awarded to Black students in 2015, and they had more diversity on their campuses than many traditionally white colleges, including my own, when you consider that 17% of students enrolled identified as something other than Black in 2015. There are consistent calls for Black colleges to close, despite the reality that as a group, they continue to enroll a larger proportion of Black students than many top-tier traditionally white colleges and have far more racially diverse campuses than many of their white counterparts. Organizations like Black colleges will adapt to get what they need. But to make things fair, we must consistently challenge and change the institutional framework and force it to abandon the white logic to which it clings. Thank you.